Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at the two studios, allpointstv.com and 92.1, which is WFOV. And we are very happy to be here again on Monday at 2 o'clock, our regular time. And we will be here for the next hour. Hope you'll stay tuned for the program today. Want to thank WFOV for picking the program up and carrying it on their network. And I want to commend again Paul Herring, who is just absolutely a phenomenon here in the city of Flint, one of the unsung heroes and one of the pillars of the community, an icon in my estimation, doing some remarkable things. And John, I don't know if you noticed it, but that station has done something that's very unique. They break up their talk programs, and when they do a break, rather than going to a commercial all the time, what they're doing, sometimes they're breaking up the conversation with music so that they can re-energize the audience and then get back to the format of the programs that they have. Have you noticed that, John? Have you noticed that?
Yeah,
how they do that? I don't think there's any other station that's ever done that before.
And another thing unique about that is Paul Herring wants people who are local musical people, musicians, to submit their stuff, so that he can get some radio play for them. But it's got to be clean format. I mean, they got to follow FCC guidelines there because they're not on they're on the internet too, but they're also on the radio, and so they got to appease the gods of the FCC. So anyway, if you're a local musical person and you would like to have some you recorded stuff, if it's a clean version, it does have a lot of explicit bad language or whatever, or more offensive language. Nowadays, we got to worry about offending everybody. So submit, just contact Paul Herring through Facebook or through, if WFOV is also on Facebook too, they have a page. So contact him and ask for the guidelines and see if you can get your music heard by the population you hopefully want him to hear. So
yeah, they have a clean format. That programming they have over there is addictive. You listen to you intend to tune in a program, and before you knew it, you're just sitting there waiting for the next program to come on. And there's a program that comes on 11 o'clock. Whose opinion is it anyway? And I had the great fortune to be on that program. They tape on Fridays at 5 o'clock, and they re-air the program at 11 o'clock on Saturday mornings. And this program comes on there right after. That's a great program, and some of the things they're doing, they have so much charisma. And I was noticing how this is my first time inside the studio, and I was noticing how they're working the Facebook at the same time they're airing the program. A lot of things are happening inside the studio that you have to be there to see. And a lot of people are calling in, a lot of persons are checking in the program on Facebook. And it's just unbelievable the kind of things that are happening at that studio. I would love to see them get a lot more voltage, because they need to be much more of a national program. And that studio needs to get out a lot more than it is in terms of the Genesee County area. Anyway, I do want to commend them for what they are adding and contributing to the community. We're going to be doing a two-part series today and Monday of next week. We'll do part 2 of a program that I want to do, kind of on the deep state, but I want to put a historical, I want to place it in historical context, and in a context that is historically grounded, because I think that we are not necessarily looking at this as a event that's taking place that's steeped in the past. And I think we've had the deep state really operating in this country ever since this country was founded. In other words, what we are saying right now, with the deep state being exposed, I think the deep state has always existed in this country. And I would define the deep state a little bit differently than most persons that are saying it's some group that's above our elected officials. I think we can just simply get away from that understanding, because we're seeing it up close and personal right now. The deep state is really the political leadership that is in fact masked. And what we are seeing right now is an unmasking of the deep state that's taking place. Last week they had the firing of Andrew McCabe, the assistant director of the FBI, and he is trying to claim that he was in fact targeted by the Trump administration. But what really we are saying is that the deep state is being called on what they've been doing behind the scenes, and now they're being called to answer for what they've been doing behind the scenes, and they do not like this idea of being exposed because they work in darkness. They are a phantom group, not because they are invisible, but the mask they're wearing is such that we don't see behind the mask who they really are. If you want to see who they are, by the way, just listen to what's taking place right now with a candidate who no one thought was going to lose in 2016. All the polls were indicating that Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide, and the projection was that Donald Trump would be lucky if he got 100 electoral votes. You know, you need 270 electoral votes to become president. And they were saying he wouldn't even get 100 electoral votes, and there's going to be a whitewash in terms of just a tremendous landslide election because he had no shot. Of course, I was looking at the crowds he was pulling at his rallies and how many persons were going to the rallies that Hillary Clinton was in fact convening, and it was not even close. And I said to a lot of people here in the area that something is happening here is not being reported. And hold on to your hat, because what we are seeing here is something very different than was being reported. Because we saw those crowds that Donald Trump was drawing, and I said, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and don't give up on this hope that we'll get away from the two parties being in control of the destiny of this country, because something is happening in the landscape right now that's not being reported. And sure enough, Donald Trump came through and got, according to the vote, 306 electoral votes, and ended up with, I think, 304 electoral votes. After the two defectors who should have cast their ballots based upon the vote in the states, two defectors who had no faith in the integrity of the political system voted otherwise, and some did that for Hillary Clinton as well. But Donald Trump came out, and this was a tsunami election that went against all of the pundits, saying that this was not going to be possible given the way the polls were indicating he had no shot at the outcome, at successfully having become the nominee. But that did not happen, and they did not intend for this to take place, which is why they were so arrogant in terms of the violation of the laws of the country, such as Andrew McCabe, the assistant director of the FBI, James Comey, who was the FBI director, and before him, Robert Mueller, who is now investigating the so-called collusion between the Donald Trump campaign and Russia. And of course, we know, because we've been looking at this for the last 14 months, which is the amount of time his investigation has been going forward, and they have not found one scintilla of any evidence of any collusion that took place during this time period, and they're not going to find any evidence of any collusion. And I would like for any of them that's doing this investigation, that includes you, Mueller, to tell us how the collusion was being carried out in the first place, and how Russia would have interfered with the election in this country, and had caused the outcome to be different than it would have been if they had not been involved in collusion. You can also, while you're at it, tell us why collusion would be a crime.
You know, before 2001, I'm a suspicious person, but I always took the voting process for granted. You know, I mean, somebody cast their vote, that's who was supposed to, even if you don't like it, you just have to lump it, you know. But after that, it seems like the left, and it's usually the left that's pushing this. It's like, oh, we got this as an unfair process, and yet nobody's saying the people who are objecting have a large hand in designing it and creating in the first place. I do not understand this. Why can't I'd like to know the questions of who helped implement. Maybe we should go back to where everything's just written down, then they have to actually by hand count votes instead of depending. If you remove it from the computer, you remove the input coming in from alleged source, other sources. Why don't we do that? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're so damn concerned about it, excuse my expression, we're so bloody concerned about it, then why don't we stop? If there's a weak spot, eliminate that weak spot and take it offline.
John, I am convinced that the deep state that is being uncovered right now, I am absolutely convinced that history, if you study the record very closely, history indicates that we've had a deep state in this country ever since the framers were putting this system in place. In other words, once they began to govern, we see that in the background there was another voice there. For example, when they elected George Washington president of the United States, in Washington's cabinet there was Thomas Jefferson, whom you know will become the third president of the United States, the one that had written the Declaration of Independence. He will become the Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton, who had a very different view, a big government view, a federalist view of the Constitution, a federalist view of the Constitution, meaning a national view of the Constitution, that power will emanate from Washington, from the nation's capital. At that time it was in Philadelphia, though, but I'm talking about the nation's capital, the power emanating from there, and then it is being dispersed to the states, which is a total reversal of how the Constitution is really constructed, because the federal government was created by the states. And this is another point that I made on the radio station last Wednesday, and got me into this discussion about the deep state, and also who these persons are that's running this country, and they're running it from behind the scenes. But I contend we can prove that there was a voice underneath the ceiling of the elected officials that was operating at the very beginning of the country, and that deep state apparatus has grown humongously in volume over a period of time, to the point where this government has been captured now by the deep state. And Donald Trump, who I consider to be a transformative president, and it's not so much because of him as a personality, but just because of his outsider status. And they did not intend to have someone that's not beholden to the ruling class in both of the two parties to get the presidency. And that's why he's being opposed so much by the Democrats and also the Republicans. You need to be watching this, because they understand the dangers they're in, and they are going to fight. They are not going to surrender the power they've been willing from behind the scenes and allow this to go on without a fight. And Andrew McCabe, who was dismissed last week, Friday, he was fired around 10 o'clock last Friday night, was fired as from his deputy. Well, he was fired from if he had stayed 2 more days, he would have been able to collect his pension. He was fired before that because he did not deserve a pension based upon how he was carrying himself and violating the canons of his oath as the assistant director of the FBI. And this is not something that's new here. The assistant director of the FBI is also in the same position as the ones who brought down the Nixon administration. Deep Throat was Mark Felt, and Mark Felt was the FBI assistant FBI director. That was the person that was feeding information out from the government and leaking information and feeding it to Bob Woodward, and Carl Bernstein, the ones that wrote the book called All the President's Men. And they were being fed information with the idea that Mark Felt was going to bring down the Nixon administration. And I know everybody out there has heard about how much of a crook Richard Nixon was. Tell me who in Washington who is not a crook. Which of those politicians do you think that's been up there 20 and 30 years? One of them is getting ready to step down now from Mississippi. It's been there 40 years. You tell me who's been in Washington for that length of time, elected over and over again, that's not corrupt in the nation's capital. Who do you think that person would be? We are in organized crime. These people are organized gangsters. Organized Crime. This is one of the books I brought to the studio. This one is written by Thomas DeLorenzo. And I bring it to the studio on a constant basis because I want to always be able to document that when I say we're talking about gangsters here, I have Thomas DeLorenzo's research in his book called Organized Crime, The Unvarnished Truth About Government. And it's not just my verdict, it's also the verdict of those who have done some tremendous investigative work to uncover the deep state that's operating behind the scenes in the nation's capital. And I am saying here, they've always been there, because Alexander Hamilton was a part of the deep state apparatus in George Washington's administration. And that's really why there was a conflict going on between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. You recall now that Alexander Hamilton was the major writer of the documents that justified the ratification of the Constitution. The 85 Federalist Papers, 51 of those were written by Alexander Hamilton.
Wasn't he also a proponent of a centralized bank too?
He was a proponent of that,
and which automatically means, and the founders, the rest of the founders, many of them at least, saw that as a bigger threat to a free country than the standing military.
Yes.
Now we have both. Okay.
Yeah, you see the contradiction here with Alexander Hamilton. I know all of you saw the play, but one of the contradictions with Alexander Hamilton is that they had fought against England and the central bank that was operative in England. But after having fought that battle, Alexander Hamilton is fighting now to set a central bank up here in the United States. And if he had been successful, of course we did have the central bank for a period of time, but after starting in 1791, you are fighting this battle to get away from the central bank, because if the federal government has its own purse strings, then because it can in fact write its own checks, the check and balance system can be subverted, because the money will allow the government to in fact expand its operations, because there's the money in order to do so. And the framers had enough prescience to limit the purse strings of the government, because there was another way of maintaining a check and a balance upon the government going out of control. That's why they were not allowed to tax income on the federal level. On the state level, the states could raise their own money through the taxation of its citizens. The federal government was not given the right to tax income. It wasn't until 1913 that we'd have persons' income being taxed with the 16th Amendment.
Now look at now, after that happened, we had an increase in involvement in foreign wars. We had an increasement in what's definitely graft and corruption within the governments, because the money had to flow. You had to give it to them. So now they can do whatever they want to you with it. So.
And now they're getting ready to meet next week to raise the debt ceiling again, because although they are taxing the public to the tune of $3.27 trillion a year, they're spending $4 trillion, because they don't intend to give back any of the power back to the states and to the people therein, which is required by the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. All powers that's not enumerated, not delegated to the federal government, are therein, because they're not delegated powers and not enumerated to give those powers to the federal government. Those powers, therefore, are retained by the states. The states having created the federal government, they're retained by the states, which is another indication the states are dictating to the federal government what its rights will be. And they can only do that if they're in fact conceding some of their own authority to the federal government and saying, you can do these things, but beyond that, you can do no others. The enumeration of powers is being dictated to the federal government by the states. And they are now have broken away from that tethering that had occurred, because when you passed that 16th Amendment in 1913, it allowed the government to go completely awry to what was intended by the framers. And they would not recognize anything this federal government is doing right now. They would not recognize the government they created, because we're so out of control right now, because Washington, the deep state, has taken over and captured the nation. This country has been captured by the deep state. But it starts out with Alexander Hamilton. And I give Hamilton a lot of credit as far as what he wrote in the Federalist Paper. There's some tremendous ideals in the 85 Federalist Papers, 51 written by Alexander Hamilton, 29 of those written by James Madison, the father of the Constitution, and 5 written by John Jay. Those 85 papers have tremendous philosophical content. These framers were very brilliant, but they, just like anyone else, had the same flaws when it came down to power as anyone else would have. And in wielding power, they were just as much about going out of control with the use of power as anyone else was. And the restraints that were placed upon the government, we began to see that beginning to come unravel at the very foundation point. And one of those voices in the background was Alexander Hamilton. And they continued to work from the rear of the restraints that they were involved in putting in place there. They were working to untether the strictures and those controls. We see it with Thomas Jefferson, with the annexation of the Louisiana Territory. He had no authority to do that. So that tethering that was intended by the framers, we see this unraveling taking place very early in the nation's history. The only point I'm making here is that the deep state has been here for a long time, and we're now seeing it come and unravel by what is being done here during the Trump administration. We have got to pay attention here, because as long as Donald Trump is in office, the longer he's there, the more threat he's posing, because there's a lot of baggage these persons have, and they either will get Donald Trump, or Donald Trump is going to, by being outside of that orbit of their control, Donald Trump is going to continue to be a liability to those vested interests that's there in the nation's capital, and they've got to either stop him or they're going to be stopped. And that's what they're fighting about, right now. This fighting that's taking place with Andrew McCabe. McCabe should have been fired a long time ago. This deep state lying in front of the Senate, going before Congress and taking the oath to tell the truth, and then lying about the leaking. Comey, the former FBI director, they asked him point blank, "Have you ever been a leaker to the press?" And he said no. And they asked him, "Have you ever authorized anyone else to do any leaking to the press?" He said no again. And now we have Comey being contradicted by Andrew McCabe, because McCabe said once he was fired, he came out and said that nothing that he do that was not authorized. He was saying that he had the approval of his commander, and his commander could only have been James Comey. So what he was doing out there in terms of talking to the press and whatever he was saying to them, he had the authorization to do that. And I'll be watching, hopefully you'll be watching as well. Are they going to call these two men in? Because we got two stories here, and we need to find out which one of them is telling the truth and which one of them is lying. Although both of them have been less than teller to the truth.
Don't you wonder what these guys would have done in their lives if they hadn't had the path of being a bureaucrat in a organization that was so closely knit and so obscured, their actions so under a secrecy and stuff like that. I mean, could you imagine these people actually having to be as they are in private corporations?
No, I can't, because they don't have any. I don't see any skills that these persons have. That's why when you look at their background, they have all this experience in terms of living on the government dole. They are in this position, they move to another position, then they move up, and they continue to get promoted up to another level. And the Peter principle is being applied because they really started out at their level of incompetence. It wasn't that they rose up to a level, they were already incompetent. And they just simply stayed inside of the government dole, and they are parasites. They live on the government's dime. We are the one producing the wealth, and then the wealth is extracted by those who are in government. And McCabe, you look at McCabe's background. if they weren't in government, and that's probably 99% of them up there, if they were not in government, they would not be productively employed, and in their employment, they're not productive in what they're doing. We're going to take a break right now from 92.1. We're going to take a break, and we're going to let them come back in 4 minutes, and we hope you'll come back on the other side of your break, and want to again commend you for tuning in the program. We're going to continue here at allpointstv.com, and we are going to be talking about a couple of books that I brought here. I brought 7 books to the studio because I wanted to document some things that I'll be talking about in the next 2 programs, this program and the one we're doing next week.
Now, how many hours a week do you take in reading? Because, I mean, I've seen you come here with stacks of books for about better part of 9 years now.
I wish you could come downstairs in my basement and see my library.
And you're actually one person who's actually probably read about 80 to 90% of what you actually own.
I have. John, been doing this for 30 years, so when you have been out there that long, I used to have roommates that would leave on Saturday morning, and they go out and maybe have breakfast with their friends. They come back in the afternoon. I'm sitting in the same chair, and they would come back and say, "I don't believe this," and because I'd be sitting in that chair on Saturday reading all day. And so I have an extensive library, and I brought 7 books from my library to the studio because I want to validate this deep state. And I want to document it from the standpoint that we have to look at some things we've been told that based upon the documentation cannot be true. I'm challenging, it took me a long time to understand how both parties are making use of Abraham Lincoln, for example. Both parties benefit from this nonsense. Abraham Lincoln fought a war in this country to free the slaves. And when I go on in these programs and say that we have not fought any war in this country over slavery, and we have fought no civil war in this country, then everybody, like last Wednesday, the person on the program was telling me that George, you're embarrassing yourself. I'm not embarrassing myself. You don't know the facts because you've been brainwashed in school, just like everybody else has learned that nonsense, been brainwashed in school. There's been no civil war fought in this country. We have fought 2 terror wars, 2 large terror wars in this country. We've been fighting wars in this country ever since we got here over taxation. There's been one war after another. We've been fighting in this country over taxation, and they've covered that up. And I had to unlearn, because I went to school just like everybody else did, and I had one of my master's degrees in history, the other one's in economics. In undergrad, I had 3 majors, one of which was political science. And so all my training was such that I was in the same zone of understanding as everybody else was in. All these members that got PhDs and things of that sort, they're brainwashed too. These persons writing these books like Stephen Oates. Stephen Oates has to be out of his mind writing a book called titled "With Malice Toward None." You have to be insane to write a book like that. And of course he's dishonest, writing a book with malice toward none. And this book is taken. The title of the book is taken from Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he said, "With malice toward none," and you got 700,000 people laying out there on the battlefields of this country dead because of Abraham Lincoln's tyranny. And you can say what you want to about it. This is not a civil war. This is a war. This is a war of Southern secession. You can call it that, or you can call it a war of the Northern invasion, where the North invaded the South. This is not a war over slavery. And those historians who are saying otherwise, I wish you would come into my space with that nonsense. We can't both be right, and I'm right and you're wrong. I brought some books here. I said organized crime, but let me read something from this book. This book is called Those Dirty Rotten Taxes. This book is written by Charles Adams, and I got a little marker here, but I wanted to, on chapter 8, let me read something from Charles Adams' book. You can believe this is not going to be in any of the classrooms in any college in this country. And these colleges are becoming more and more basketball schools. You got the Sweet 16, and you look out there on that basketball court, and you ask yourself the question, which one of those persons even go to class today? Which one of those persons would be able to be in some of these classes that have scholarly rigor, and they are playing basketball and away from their classes, and they're staying eligible, and they're out there doing all this practicing and things of that sort to play basketball in these universities, which is what these universities are about right now. It's called the chapter 8 in the book by Charles Adams, Those Dirty Rotten Taxes. Chapter 8 is called The Abominable Tariff. He says the American people used the ballot box to oust the Federalist Party and the taxes they tried to institute. Their taxes were repealed and their bureaucracy, and he puts in parentheses, the forerunner of the IRS, dismantled. They said dismantled the taxes and also the bureaucracy they put in place. Except for import duties, all other federal taxes disappeared. They reappeared for a short season after the War of 1812, but again, they did not last long. From 1800 to 1861, taxes took on a different character. Not so much in how they were raised, but with regard to their effect on manufacturing. The country was in its commercial infancy, and it was popular to adopt protective tariffs so local businesses would not be destroyed by competition from Europe. The first such tariff had substantial support around the nation, even in the South. But by the 1820s, Southern planters began to see the tariff as an unjust, even unconstitutional tax. The 1828 tariff, which was the highest in history, was called the Tariff of Abomination. Southerners wanted an open market for manufactured goods. Northerners wanted an exclusive market rid of foreign competition. The high tariff forced the Southerners either to buy northern goods at inflated prices or to pay highly taxed imports that went to enrich northern coffers. Let me explain what they're saying here. The Southerners were at first all down with the idea of taxing imports because of the infancy of the manufacturing base in this country, and Europe had a head start in its manufacturing base. So given the infantile level of operation inside the country, to get them off the ground and allow them to be able to withstand the competition from Europe, you tax the goods coming in from Europe. The North went along with that because it would benefit them, because that's where the manufacturing base would be in terms of the North. And the South went along with it until it began to disadvantage the South. And these tariffs are going up more and more and more. So the goods, the cost of the goods inside this country is being increased more and more as well. And at a certain point, around 1820, the South is feeling disadvantaged in that. In 1828, they passed the tariff, which the South called the Tariff of Abomination, because now they're saying that this taxation, the tariff on imports, this taxation was in fact making the South pay a higher price for the goods, And also because you're putting a tariff on the goods that are being imported to the country, the exporting South, the South is exporting its goods into the European market. And so they're paying a tax on the goods being exported because we're taxing goods being imported into this country. And so therefore the prosperity of the North, because the taxes are going to the coffers of the North, because that's where the manufacturing base is, the South is now paying for the prosperity of the North. And that's why they're objecting to it. And they're threatening at this point in 1832 that if this is not stopped, they will in fact succeed from the Union. And they're threatening that under Andrew Jackson. And Jackson makes the same threat that would be made later on by Abraham Lincoln. It was Andrew Jackson that says he'll put 75,000 soldiers down there in South Carolina and these other southern states as they try to succeed from the Union. And was that 30, that'd be 29 years later, the South having the problem going uncorrected for another 3 decades, finally will succeed from the Union. And in succeeding from the Union, they were objecting to taxation, not because of representation. They were objecting to the tariff taxation because it unfairly put a tax burden upon the southern states, and that's why they were in fact joined. In the beginning point, South Carolina was joined by 6 other states. 7 states have succeeded. By the time Abraham Lincoln has left from Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, and is on his way to the nation's capital to be inaugurated as the 16th president of the United States. Now, last week I read you some parts of Abraham Lincoln's speech. And if anybody thinks this is about slavery, rather than reading Stephen Oates' book, mistitled Malice Toward None, he didn't tell anybody that he's quoting Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural speech. He didn't say anything about that on the front cover of his book, with Malice Toward None. You've had a war going on from 1861 to 1865. Lincoln gives a second inaugural address on March the 4th, 1865. And here's this historian, this dishonest historian, Stephen Oates, writing a book with Malice Toward None. He doesn't tell the reader that is in the last paragraph of Lincoln's second inaugural address, with Malice Toward None. You don't fight a war and don't have malice. 600,000 persons died in this war. And Lincoln said in his first inaugural speech, and I'll read this part again, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." So Lincoln is not even inclined to do anything about slavery. And that is this book right here, written by H.W. Crockett III. This is not going to be in any of the college classes either. It's called The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Civil War. And the first bullet on the cover of this book by Crocker III, he says, "You think you know about the Civil War, but did you know?" Bullet number 1, the secession was legal. Now, what is Crocker talking about in terms of secession was legal? I said earlier, you historians listen very carefully, because all of you are dishonest. You see, it's not just fake news. You hear this word fake news. It's not just fake news. It's fake history, fake government, fake politicians. The whole network is fake. You think you know about the Civil War, but did you know, listen carefully to this point, bullet number 2, that the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. Where is that taught in a classroom? Is that taught at Harvard University? This nation's greatest school, the top of the line? Bullet number 3, that the South had the moral high ground in the war, and the editorial support of the Vatican's own newspaper, the Pope. The Pope had even prohibited the Catholics inside this country to side with the North. Bullet number 4. Did you know that Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis expected slavery to fade away naturally? That if the South, and this is bullet number 5, that if the South had won, we might be able to enjoy a holiday now in the sunny southern state of Cuba, because that would have been what they had intended to do, to expand into Cuba. But the secession was based upon taxation. Then you say, well, if it was based upon taxation, how do you then justify that by the time this war came to a close, slavery would have been abolished in this country as a result of this war? And the answer is very simple. The ending of slavery in this country was a consequence of the war, not a cause of it. I asked this question last week. How can this war even be a war over slavery when you had slavery in both the northern camp and in the southern camp? And this junk you have in these textbooks where they talk about border states, maybe you think you can have a state without borders. And I want somebody to tell me, some of you historians out there to tell me, what do you mean by border states? Maybe you think that you can have a country without borders. What is a border state? Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. Those 4 states are called border states. So are you saying then that the other 31 states who were in the Union at this time, they didn't have borders? Every state is a border state. Tell me a state, even California, thank God for that, they got borders. That way they don't have to, they won't be encroaching into places like Nevada and other states in the West with their nonsense. So they are this state here on the West Coast, and they have borders around it, so that they can't be influencing what's happening in these other states because they are a sanctuary state. But do you know of any state that doesn't have borders? And why are they called border states? They're called border states because to call them a border state is to keep from calling them what? Union states. And if they are union states and they have slaves, then they're slaves on the side of the Union. And you tell me how you're fighting a war over slavery when there's slavery inside the Union. This war is not over slavery. This is a tax war. It's a war over tariff. And I was saying earlier, I had to figure out what is being advantaged here and who's being advantaged by the way Lincoln is in fact described as this nation's greatest president. I was listening to a person last night on this great philosopher in Canada. He was interviewing one of the real scholars here. You won't hear his name too much. You won't hear Malinois' name too much. But he was interviewing this scholar, Larry. I think his last name is Williams. I just came in contact with his work the other day, and he was saying that in his estimation, the 3 greatest presidents, he said the 3 greatest, not in any particular order. He named one of them, was John Tyler. You know, Tippecanoe and Tyler too in 1840. They ran with William Harrison. And Harrison, he claims Harrison was a great president, but Harrison only in there for 1 month, and it wasn't able to do any damage. That he considers great presidents, those that were not able to get off to do damage. So Tyler, you tell somebody that Tyler was a great president. I haven't heard anyone say that before. If you talk about great president, they talk about Abraham Lincoln being the greatest president. Why do you think that will take place? Here's a man that led an aggressive war against the southern states that had, according to Crocker, the right to succeed. That the South had the moral high ground in the war, and they had the right to succeed. The secession was legal. This is Crocker's point. They had the right to succeed from the Union. And they had the high moral ground in this war. Now, when you start saying, let me quote another book before making this next point. Here's a book written by the twins, James Ronald Kennedy and Walter Donald Kennedy, the two historians from North Carolina. And their book is called, get ready for this one, Was Jefferson Davis Right? And they're saying Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, was Jefferson Davis right? And they are referring to two books written by Jefferson Davis. The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government, Volume 1. You can see how those of you who are watching it on the air on 92.1, I will listen to it on the air on 92.1, can't see the book, but on allpointstv.com, you can see the books that I brought here. These are very thick volumes in terms of what's written by Jefferson Davis. And the book written by the Kennedys, the twins, James Ronald and Walter Donald Kennedy, asking the question, was Jefferson Davis right? They are referring back to this book, these two volumes that Jefferson Davis wrote. And to answer the question, was Jefferson Davis right? Well, he is right if the South was right. And this is the other book that the Kennedys wrote. The South was right. Now, when you say that, and you say it, and here's a black person saying it, all of the unwashed, those who've been brainwashed in these indoctrination centers, think that you are therefore endorsing slavery. Pure nonsense. I'm endorsing states' rights. And therefore, I am endorsing the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, and also Article 1, Section 8, which enumerates the powers of the federal government that will not submit to the Constitution, because this country has been captured by Washington, by those politicians in Washington. And last week when we did this program, I noticed on the YouTube, they had a question up on my wall to compare the program that we did last week with other programs, asking the question, I guess it was asked to the wider audience, how would you rate this program compared to the other programs that are on YouTube? And the first answer was poor. 3 negative comments first before he got down to some of the positive things. I put on there, it was an outstanding program. Whether it's outstanding or not. But I had never seen that question asked before. So somebody's paying attention to what we're doing here, but I intend to do it because I'm gonna be in your face. See, we got to get the truth out about what's happening. We can't correct this problem unless we know how we got here. And I have to figure out now, a long time I just was in that zone of thinking based upon my training, and that's what it is, training. I was trained into a certain understanding. It took me a long time to break away from how they're using Abraham Lincoln as a linchpin to an understanding that these politicians are benevolent, figures. You used to have this idea of benevolent, kings, benevolent rulers, divine kings, divine right of kings. All this about the politicians being benevolent. And they are doing the greatest good for the greatest many. And I was so brainwashed myself, quite frankly, is that even after I had studied the Republic in my political science class, undergraduate school, and I had a great teacher, Mrs. Russell, in that class, I was still coming out. After he raised a question, where are these? I guess I was brainwashed by reading the Republic, because what you have in the Republic was this idea that these rulers are divine, kings. They're philosopher kings, and they're there to do the greatest good for the greatest many. I actually believe that was really what they were. What I thought our politicians were, beyond the pale. They're moral. They have virtue and things of that sort, and they're wielding power because they want to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people in the country.
Actually, the best way I'd say to sum up the American political experience, don't look to the Republic. It in itself has got several issues in that book itself. But if you actually want a good, true grasp of it, watch Godfather 1, Godfather 2, watch the entire series, all from beginning to end of The Sopranos. That's what those politicians are more like than these noble characters. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Organized crime. That's the first book that I quoted here. This is a well-researched book by Thomas De Lorenzo. Organized Crime: The Unvarnished Truth About Government. This is government unmasked.
We have a former mayor that got booted out of office here in Flint. I'm not going to name names, but anybody who's in the know knows who this is. And he was booted out of office because of his ineptness. He turns around, he did some serious stuff. He turns around and is now wanting to run for a state rep seat. This man has no conscience. I mean, they are totally divorced from their past actions. We all have learning curves, we can say that. But guess what? When it affects as many people's lives as this individual's actions did, yet if we were to disregard, if we plowed into a bunch of people who are using our vehicle by accident, we did take our license away from him. This guy should not be allowed to run for public office again, or anybody who's given this guy serious consideration is a damn idiot, in my opinion.
There is no virtue in the political arena. And anyone that has any confidence in a politician, anything they say, you have got to be kidding me. I'm even more extreme in this regard than Walter E. Williams at George Mason University. Williams makes the point that the way you can tell whether or not a politician is telling the truth or whether or not he's lying, quite frankly, is whether or not he's moving his lips. If he's moving his lips, he's lying. He or she is lying.
If they're sitting there pausing, they're thinking of how to lie to you.
Or when they're quiet, look at what they've been thinking about, look when they express what they're thinking about, and then they begin to lie. Because that's the nature of the occupation. Politics is the art of deception. So Williams makes that point. He does it out front and, personal in your face. And I make that same point, that these politicians are masked. They are the deep state. And it took me a long time to understand that, because I was buying into the Abraham Lincoln myth. We got 600,000 to 700,000 people out there on the battlefield, where those persons have been killed within 4 years' time by a man that they said that he was fighting a moral war to free the slaves. It made him the greatest president this country has had in its history, and got him up there above George Washington, who is the only great president this country's had. Who else would you name? I know that on the Melano program they put Tyler up there. He put Grover Cleveland up there, the 22nd president and the 24th president, because he was elected to non-conservative terms, and put him up there in 1884 to 1888. Really, the step down 89 in March of the following year, but he was voted out of office in 88, and then Benjamin Harrison came in, and then he ran again in 92 and won a second term. He considers Grover Cleveland to be a great president because he's a non-interventionist. And John and I have decided, we've said in the past that Calvin Coolidge was a great president.
I want one boring, melt in the background, and not be memorable. That's, to me, what the conception of a good president is.
That's the intention of the framers. They have these persons non-interventionists, and the ones that are non-interventionists have been the great presidents. Roosevelt, this person, Malinois' program, John, he put Franklin Delano Roosevelt up there as one of our worst presidents.
Well, I totally agree with that. I mean,
one of our worst presidents.
He set us on a path that actually, all the issues we're dealing with now, basically funding these legacy programs, like Social Security, because that's the money's there. It should have been. It should be a solvent thing. Government officials take it, use it for everything else, but what it was intended for. So he is, and plus all the dust could create around him, allowing us to get pulled into Second World War. My opinion. He is the worst.
I think he's down there now, where they have. I'm talking about where the rulers have Roosevelt. They have. Abraham Lincoln number 1, and then they have Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the second greatest president, and they got George Washington number 3, the third greatest president we've had, and there's Washington standing alone by himself up there at the very top, and they got this absolute. I have to say this, a person that was a monster for what this man did, having ignited a war that cost the lives of 600,000 persons. How is that person the greatest president this country has had? You're saying the formation of the deep state at the very beginning, and also with Abraham Lincoln. We're going to get out of here, but we're going to continue this discussion next week because we've got to understand what we're looking at right now. Until next week, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.